Welcome everyone to Nova Scribes. This is Brian Tarallo. I'm a graphic facilitator and the managing director of Lizard Brain Solutions. We are recording this evening, just as a reminder, and I am here with my friend Ed Jones, who is a CPA, which stands for Certified Public Accountant.
That's correct.
Can be taught.
Not just a public accountant, certified.
Certified. And you specialize in business taxes and small business.
That's correct. I have a lot of startup clients and a lot of clients in the 1 million to 15 million range, and I've led all throughout different aspects of their formation and setup and growth and all the troubles and tribulations that creates.
Well, thanks a lot for meeting with us. You've worked a lot with me in helping me get my own business started up, and sometimes that can be a rocky road for visual practitioners. Before we jump into it and we address some of the questions that we've gotten from you all, I want to kick it back to Lauren just to tell us a couple things about Nova Scribes. Lauren, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. So we'll just do a little intro to Nova Scribes. If this is anyone's first Nova Scribes event, why don't you just write raise hand in the chat or speak up. Anyone's first time? I think there might be a couple folks. Aha, oh, someone raised their hand. Diana, first time. Excellent, welcome. Cool, and I see Lynn and Trina on here as well. Thank you. So thank you, Ed, first time. So if this is your first time at Nova Scribes, we are an open forum for visual practitioners to share knowledge. We are anyone who uses visuals to move others, graphic facilitators, graphic recorders, scribes, sketch noters, video scribers, UX designers, and visual consultants, et cetera, et cetera. We have organized classes, graphic jams, open spaces, and we're doing more webinars lately so that we can share knowledge wider and with a larger audience, and just share our skills and learn from each other. Just to have the date on your calendar, we posted it today, but it has not been announced yet, but we're gonna be doing an in-person design thinking workshop. So design thinking for graphic facilitators, that will be, we try to stick with the third Thursday of every month. So that will be the evening of February 15th. So please make sure to go sign up for that on the meetup.com/Nova Scribes. And let's see, that's at 6:30. It'll be in Chantilly, Virginia. Let's see. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. The rule is if you get booted out for any reason, just call back in. just dial back in and we'll troubleshoot. If you have any issues, I'll be monitoring the chat, so you can always chat in and let me know privately or publicly. There's only a few folks here if you're having any technical issues, and we'll work to resolve those. Brian said we are recording, so we'll just ask that you mute yourself when you're not talking. We may, there's only a few folks, so I'm not going to mute everyone, but unless it creates distraction. But if you do get muted, you can just unmute yourself on your computer to talk or press *6 on your phone. So that's the rule for that. Let's see. You can also, if this is your first time with Zoom, just a couple more things. You can change, so right now we have the video spotlighted on Brian and Ed. If you would like to be nosy and see who else is on the call, you can use the little slider at the top of your screen to click around to different videos, and you can also click the little gallery view button over there. So kind of mouse over your different tools to get to the chat tool. You press chat and all of that. So those are the main things that you're going to need to know for this. Lastly, please let us know any feedback that you have after the call, or if this brings up any other topics that you're interested in that we don't cover, please let us know. If there's any questions that we're not sure about, we may open it up to the group and assess the knowledge in the room, or we will get back to you. The last thing is we may have a sketch noter, so we may have some sketch notes after the call. So I think that's all for my housekeeping and my introduction to Nova Scribes. Brian, anything else?
Yeah, thank you. And I would say, so thank you very much. Heather Lynn offered to sketch note for us, so I really appreciate that. Yeah. What I would say is that since I'm not going to be, for the first time, I think, at a Nova Scribes, not going to be recording on the wall, if anybody else would like to practice some sketch noting, please go ahead and do that. And if you'd be comfortable sharing it with the group, we'll go ahead and post it to the Nova Scribes website so that everybody can go back and refer to your sketch notes. So thank you for that. So thank you, Lauren, for kicking us off.
No problem.
Little disclaimer. So first of all, we're going to be sharing our perspectives. Ed's focus is really on the financial and the tax and the entity and the legal side of things, if I can get kind of close to that.
Kind of, although we are not attorneys, we do not pretend to be attorneys, nor do we play attorneys on TV. Nothing we say should be constrained as legal advice or us acting in any way, shape, or form as though we are attorneys. We can only tell you things they've told us in the past, and sometimes our memory is faulty, but we do our absolute best.
This is why I like working with you. So what he said, so same thing.
Like I've said that before.
So we'll be sharing our own perspectives is the point. And sometimes we may hit a wall. And you might ask us a really hard question that we don't know the answer to. In that case, we will open it up because we have such a, the knowledge is in the room, as we like to say, as facilitators. So we'll open it up and hear from you as well. Okay. Also, if you have any questions along the way, Lauren is going to be monitoring chat. So feel free to type any questions that you have along the way. And speaking of questions, to kick us off, Ed, what would you say is most important for people to know when they're thinking about starting up a small business?
Well, this is something I get asked a lot. I actually was going through my notes and clients in the last 6 months, and I've probably had 7 new clients come in, all of whom were starting up businesses that I had to give the advice on this. And it covers a whole gamut. One of the most important things to decide when you're setting up your business is to really sit down and figure out how should the economics of it look? How are you going to be charging? How will you be collecting? What is your goals? The amount of money you need from a cash flow perspective to be making to make sure you can eat or achieve your goals, and write those down. Because you need to be able to have a way to check it 6 months, 7 months later. After that, you need to start figuring out some of the intangibles you've forgotten about from a cash flow perspective, such as, hey, you're making money. You're probably going to need to pay taxes at some point. When you pay those taxes, that's going to come out of your bank account. When you're self-employed, when you're running your own business, you don't always see that immediately until you file your taxes the next year, unless you have someone advising you. And that can be a whole 30, 40, 45, 50% going out the door that you aren't planning on. So you can easily throw your budget completely out of whack, which can create a great deal of confusion for yourself and for your business. Because in the end, cash needs that hit the individual owner hits the business as well. And little can stop a business faster than that. The first question that most people ask me, because normally they come to me, they have a pretty good idea of what the business is that they're going to be doing, how they expect to be making money, what contracts they're going to be having come in, and what the cash flow is going to look like. Maybe they need a little help projecting out for the next 2-3 years to really have a plan together. But they usually want to know what sort of business entity should they be, because businesses can be different sorts of entities. In my view, there's a few major things to keep in mind when choosing your business entity and a couple minor things. By business entity, I mean, should you be an LLC? Should you be incorporated? Should you be an S Corp? Should you be an LLP? Should you be an FLP? Should you be nothing? And what do all these things mean? The 3 major things to keep in mind in my head is, number 1, you want to know how protected you are if you're sued. I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be a lawyer, but I know what I've been told and what I've seen. The entity choice you choose has a direct effect upon how protected you are and your personal assets are from a lawsuit that happens to the business and vice versa. The second thing to keep in mind is, how does money get into the business? And how does money, just as importantly, get out of the business to the owner so they can eat? I've told many a client that I can make their business be incredibly successful if they just never pay themselves. Yeah. And they seem to say something about starving to death, and I go, okay, we can't do that. The third thing is, how is the income of the business taxed? When is it taxed? How is that reported? The 2 minor things, although they can be extremely major in this area or in general. One minor thing, how do different states treat that business entity, especially if you operate across state lines? We're in the greater DC area, which means we can, by blinking, be in Maryland, Virginia, and DC, all of whom treat different entities differently. LLCs are especially famous for having a problem with this, because LLCs, as I'll talk about later, are one of the newer entities created, and every state's dealing with them a little bit differently. So for instance, in California, I, as a CPA, cannot be an LLC. I'm directly barred. I'm not really sure why, just am. If you're an LLC in California, it's totally different from being an LLP. I pick on California because it's a big state with a lot of sophisticated rules. The other minor thing to keep in mind, but is extremely major when it happens, is how does your business entity choice affect your succession plan, especially if your succession plan is sales. There's a huge difference in selling a business that's a C corporation versus selling a business that's an S corporation or a flow-through entity as an LLC. So the big choices you usually have. You can be a sole proprietorship in a business. What's a sole proprietorship? You and the business are the same thing. It's one of the things that makes the US kind of unique in a business standpoint. It's one of the reasons why we have such an easy way to create businesses. A sole proprietorship and the person are the same. If a sole proprietorship does anything inappropriate, it's the same as the individual. There is no real liability protection between them in a pure sole proprietorship. The LLC income, or excuse me, not LLC, the sole proprietorship, money gets in by the owner simply putting the money in. Money comes out by the owner simply pulling the money out as a draw. Anything the company makes is the owner's. The tax return is filed as a Schedule C if it's a business, directly on their own tax return, on their individual return. They pay the taxes on that when they file their taxes. As a Schedule C, as a sole proprietorship, you're taxed in two ways. One, that income gets added to your overall income and is taxed at your normal marginal tax rates, whatever those happen to be. So it's just added right to your 1040. Number two, the income flows out to a Schedule SE, where the equivalent of Social Security and Medicare taxes are applied on that income. And that can be as high as a 15.3, well, in most cases it is a 15.3% tax. So that's a pretty major effect. It's the exact same tax employees are paying, where when you're getting a paycheck as a W-2, 6.2% on the first 120 or so thousand is withheld for Social Security, 1.45% of all income is withheld for Medicare. Unknown to many employees, their company is paying an equal amount on their behalf, so it's actually a 15.3% tax. I keep saying LLCs, and you'll see why when I get to LLCs. Sole proprietorships are in many ways the simplest to form and to run. The issue with them tends to be there's no liability protection, and they also file directly on the individual owner's tax return, which can be troublesome in certain cases. The nice thing about them is they're incredibly flexible. If you accidentally pay for something outside of your business account, you can deduct it inside of the sole proprietorship. You pay for something on a personal credit card, but for a business expense, as long as you've kept the receipts and tracked it, you can take deductions for it. You can deduct business mileage. You can take a home office deduction. There's a lot of things that you're allowed to do without having to go through a lot of extra formality that the other sorts of entities would require, without having to do anything special to do it, even if you haven't paid for it out of the business account. Now, I always recommend you have a separate bank account, even in a sole proprietorship for the business, if just because how else are you going to track how you're doing and be able to really see and make sure you're not missing any of your expenses.
So, sorry, I'm going to pause you for just 1 second. So a lot of information, maybe just slow it down just a little bit, because a lot of this is really new for.
Do you mind if I unpack a little bit of what
Absolutely.
you said there?
I know I'm throwing a lot of data at you.
So just
Thank you very much.
to give you a little bit about the kinds of people that we are as visual practitioners. So a lot of us, we're sort of across the range. Some of us have full-time jobs, and we do this moonlighting where we'll go out and we'll, draw in front of public for others. Some of us have started businesses of our own. Some of us actually have teams and employees. Okay, I would say that most of us are probably kind of in the moonlighting side of things.
Okay.
So in a case like that, if I'm currently working for a larger company, but on the evenings, weekends, when I've got some PTO saved up, I go off and I want to do some graphic recording and graphic facilitation. With only that in mind, where would you recommend that I start in terms of the entity? Sole proprietorship, LLC, what might you say?
In most cases, in that situation, you want to keep things simple.
Okay.
You don't want to make it overly complex for you. So in that case, I tend to advise, if you need the liability protection, you go with an LLC. An LLC is a unique creature. An LLC owned by one entity or one person. So you form an LLC that you're the only owner of. For tax purposes, it's treated as though it doesn't exist.
Right.
So it files as a sole proprietorship, which means you have the flexibility you want with it. You can make certain mistakes and it won't really create much of an issue. It's about as simple from a reporting requirement as is possible.
Mm-hmm.
If you're somebody who is going to be a slightly larger entity, especially if you're going to start having employees, then you really need to look at some of the other entities available. But I tend to recommend the LLC. You could just go as a straight sole proprietorship, but in most cases, an LLC only costs a couple $100 a year to the state corporate commission or its equivalent in that state that it's registered in. And it's kind of like having an inexpensive insurance if you have properly set it up so that you are not mixing funds or doing things like that.
Let me restate what you just said, make sure that I got it. So if I understand this correctly, that there's a difference between the way that the law sees a business entity and the way that the IRS sees a business entity. And that in the case of an LLC, that offers me a little bit of legal protection. So for example, somebody could come after my LLC, but not necessarily after me personally for the same thing. But as far as taxes, the IRS wouldn't necessarily distinguish income coming in from an LLC versus another company that I happen to be a part of. Is that right?
That's correct. In most situations, there are always caveats, but in most situations, that's essentially the correct treatment.
Got it. Thank you for that. So I have a question from Diana, and it's if you are planning, and I think it's relevant to where we're at right now, if you are planning on starting more than one sole proprietorship or LLC, how is the accounting and legal registration different?
This is
file twice.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because in reality, there's actually almost three, but I'm going to say two major questions in here if you don't realize it. Number one, from a business perspective, how would I want to do it? Which could have nothing to do with how I'm doing it from an accounting or on a tax or legal perspective. When you have different businesses that you're set up, for business purpose, you want to track each one completely separately because you want to know how each business is doing in and of itself so you know where to focus your time and attention. So mixing it all together in one account or in one tracking system can make it really hard for you to figure out how each business is doing on its own. Each business should be looked at on its own to determine what's the liability risk here? What is the danger to me here? Do they need to be protected from each other? And that helps you determine whether or not you should set them up in their own separate entities. In general, my clients tend to, let's say I have someone who is a realtor, but is also a flipper in a totally separate piece, means they buy, rehab, and sell properties, and they have a consulting business as well on the side for IT. I ran into that before. I would have each of those in their own separate entity to protect them from each other, but also so that we're very carefully tracking each one separately. Each one would file its own Schedule C. It all then gets added all together on their personal return in the end, the way it's taxed, but it would be reflected more correctly.
Thank you for that. And Diana, if there's a follow-on question behind that, feel free to go ahead and add that to the chat. Lauren, did we get another question then?
Just related to LLCs, going back to what you were talking about with setting up an LLC in one state versus another, was the question?
There's a whole bunch of, I like to say, misinformation out there. The number of times I've had clients come in and tell me, I'm going to set up I have set my LLC up in Delaware because that way I have better protections there. Or I'm going to set it up in Nevada because that way Nevada doesn't have income tax. I don't have to pay income tax. And there are situations where from a legal perspective, I've been told that can be useful, especially if you have a company going public, which is its own set of problems. In most cases, all that means is, for my clients who have done it, is, okay, you've registered in Nevada, but you're working in Virginia. So now we have to register your LLC in Virginia so you have the right to do work in this state. And we're still going to pay tax in the same place. Because just because you've created a physical place where you can be, doesn't mean we've shifted income or, for that matter, liability. You're doing the work in a state. In that state, in most cases, they're going to be able to sue you. Maybe you could have a contract with your client saying that the rules of Delaware apply because that's where we are. So your customers can't sue you, but everybody else still can. Once again, not an attorney, so I'm not an expert on that. I can just tell you what I've heard from other people. My general view is attempting to shift things that way in other states. It's one of those things that we'll talk about a little bit later when I talk about tax myths or things that are too good to be true. When something sounds too good to be true, that's because it's not true. So if it was way better off, you don't have to pay tax if you created your company inside of Nevada, then why would anyone ever not form their company in Nevada?
So I want to unpack that a little bit because I work all over the U.S. You know, I was just in Kansas City, Chicago before that, Tampa before that. The way that I've rationalized it in my head, and please tell me if I got this wrong, is that where I actually set up the work is in my home office in Virginia. And then where I actually deliver it, maybe in Kansas or what have you, but the time that it takes in order to do the prep and all of that and the post work. So it's a small amount of time that I'm actually on site. Are you telling me that I need to declare in every state that I have a business in?
Not quite.
Okay.
This is a very complex form of law that I'll be walking you through a whole bunch while I take care of stuff this year. There's something called nexus. Nexus is an accounting and legal term. It means a connection. Every state has its own set of rules of what would cause an individual or a company to have nexus with that state. If you have that nexus, you're supposed to file in that state. Now, this doesn't mean that anytime you walk into another state, you're going to have to file there. There's always thresholds, points where they require it. Most people know about these nexus rules, even though they don't realize it, from the sales tax. Because most people have heard, hey, if I buy online, it's cheaper. That's because I don't have to pay the sales tax. There's a whole bunch of rules that went into that. That's actually incorrect as well. We can get into that later. But in general, when you are physically located in another state, there's a good chance that the income being produced from that should be reported to that state. The bigger you are, the more revenue there is, the more likely it is that you're going to be noticed and made to do that. This is why if you work at a large corporation and you constantly travel around doing work for that, why when you get your W-2, they'll divide it up between 20 states.
Okay.
The reason they do that is those states caught them, slapped them on the wrist, and they put in systems in place to do that.
So give me an idea of a threshold, right? Typically, when I do a job, it will be anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000, maybe even 3,000 a day if I'm lucky.
In a lot of states, it boils down to: were you here more than 4 or 5 days?
Okay.
Did you make more than $2,000 or $3,000? There's also a certain point of materiality, although you shouldn't ignore the rules just because you feel it's too small. But if it's a few $100s, the simple fact is, if you make a mistake and don't file in there, the risk to you is incredibly small. Because let's say you have, because the states don't tax the gross revenue in most cases. Some states do, but most don't. Instead, they're taxing the net profits gets divided up between the states. So if you do $200,000 worth of business and have $2,000 in one state, that's 1% of your net profit, which maybe was only 50 grand. In theory, you could get ascribed to that state. And they do all sorts of tests in there, like, do you pay rent in that state? Do you have equipment there? Are you paying employees?
So I think we've got a couple of questions that are related to that. Is there a reliable place where we might go in order to figure out, what are those minimum thresholds when it comes to nexus?
You would have to look up each individual state. The good news is the states don't hide this information. In most cases, this is where somebody like me makes our living. There are guides out there that can help do that. Google search, especially when it goes directly into the states, you can look up and find when do they require you to file what's called a non-resident tax return. That will give you a good idea of that. But this is a extremely complex piece of law. There's specialists where this is all they do all day long, called SALT. That's it.
Any other questions that came up specifically to this, Lauren, that you saw in the chat?
Just with that one, just a foot stomp from Heather Lynn. And then we also got another question related to Nexus. We live in the DMV, so 3 closely located areas, and likely working with clients in one state, one Commonwealth, and a district. So how does that work? So it's maybe can you cater it a little bit more specifically to DMV area?
So the answer there is pretty simple. If you have, I'm going to pick on Virginia. You have your home office in Virginia. You sign all your contracts in Virginia. You do the vast majority of your work in your office in Virginia. That's where most of your revenue is going to be sourced to. If you're then going and doing direct consulting on client site, you could end up in a situation in which you've risen to the level where you have to file. I certainly have plenty of clients, business clients, who file in all 3 localities. And that can be a real pain, especially when you have to file in DC because they have an unusually complex
what level are those clients of yours at?
Most of the clients who do that, we're dealing with at least a couple $100,000 a year in revenue. Simply because at a certain point, you're going to be below the thresholds. And if you email me that later on, I'm sure I can get you some links on that, and I can provide them to you guys to put up there to see where the piece happens. And this is what I was talking about earlier with the business entity choice. The way the different states deal with the entities sometimes will cause you to change the type of entity you are.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of states don't deal with sole proprietorships very well from a multi-state view. They just don't know how to handle it. On the other hand, they know how to deal with a partnership. They know how to deal with a corporation. I've seen situations where it makes sense to incorporate just because of the dealings with the states. Pretty rare though. But the smaller ones, it tends to be a little easier than that.
There was something else that you mentioned a while back, and that was on the subject of sales tax. So I'm going to ask a hard question here. So I don't, as a visual practitioner, I don't sell anything, right? No materials on that. I do sell my services. What do I need to know about sales tax when it comes to?
I can give some generalities. Yeah. Every sales tax rule is very state specific.
In Virginia?
And sometimes county specific.
Mm-hmm.
In general, sales tax is assessed upon the transference of a tangible good.
Okay.
So for instance, I am selling a widget. That widget's being sold in that state. That sales tax will be ascribed. If you're providing professional services in Virginia, you don't tend to have a sales tax that needs to be done.
Awesome.
You can run into issues though. For instance, I have marketing companies that when they do their advice and services are also providing printing, or they're printing things out to hand to them. And if you don't carefully have your invoice set up properly, you might have just made everything you're doing for that person sales taxable. Mm-hmm. And the truly annoying thing about that is sales tax is one of the more common audits for businesses. Mm-hmm. Because there's two things they're looking for when they audit you. They're looking for, one, did you charge sales tax when you should have? Okay, maybe you're doing that all correctly. But they then turn around and say, are you paying sales tax when you buy things? Mm. This is where people who buy online get burned. Yeah. Because when you buy something online from Amazon, if they don't charge sales tax because it was actually in Ohio and they're shipping it here, you're actually supposed to, both as an individual and as a business, just very hard for individuals to be audited, you're supposed to report that in your sales tax and pay the use tax on it. So if you buy $100 worth of stuff, you should be paying $6 into Virginia. Mm-hmm. And this is highly audited. They know exactly what to look at. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Virginia individual return just added a line for individuals to pay their use tax.
Yeah, this is interesting. So one thing that I'll do when I'm graphic facilitating is that sometimes I will charge a materials fee. It's a flat fee that includes just all of this stuff: paper, ink, markers, chalk, tape, all that.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be considered sales tax, would it?
It might be. I'd have to look it up. It is that specific. There is certainly an argument that if there are materials being transferred along as opposed to consumables that you're using up that you're charging for.
More like that one.
But once again, you need to make sure of that.
Uh-huh.
You need to check it. And then the question is, well, what if you're dealing with a client you're going into in Maryland? Each state has its own set of rules. So this sounds hideously complex. You can find most of this information online, and a good CPA in the area can find it out.
Yeah, I think as a good follow-up, one of the things that I'll do, if maybe you and I can get together offline, is at least for Virginia, Maryland, and DC, is maybe come up with a matrix that we can post out there.
Oh, they already exist, so we can get that to you.
Perfect. That would have all these answers in one place.
The answers will always be moderately general, though, because sometimes a lot of this isn't very well defined, or it's defined through a court case, but one side's fighting it.
It's good to know. Thank you. So one of the questions that we had out here from Lynn, actually, is that she's considering starting her own consulting business in this year, and she wants to know what does she need to know about the new tax laws that have come out?
How many hours do we have?
Not long.
Okay. Well, it's 580 some pages of new tax laws. I'll try and give you the 3-minute thing on it. Mm-hmm. In my view, the general purpose of the new tax laws was to lower C corporate tax rates, which are big business primarily tax rates. They took those from 35%, knocked it down to 21%, a huge reduction. When they did that, they realized that they had created an incentive on people to become C corporations if they wanted to keep money in. I mean, if you're issuing money out of the C corporation, one way or another, personal taxes are going to be paid on it. Most small businesses are what are called flow-through entities, sole proprietorships, LLCs, taxes, sole proprietorships, S-corps, partnerships. The problem is, essentially, those businesses are now going to be paying a higher tax rate on money being left in the company. And that wasn't their goal. They weren't trying to give an incentive, at least they don't openly want to say that that was their goal. They weren't trying to give an incentive to be a C corporation. So they wanted to figure out a way to lower pass-through taxes as well. But this is a very complex issue, because if they simply lowered the taxes on all pass-through entities to that 21%, okay, now there's a huge incentive to be a pass-through entity. In the end, they created a new deduction, Code Section 199, not that any of you need to know that, that essentially says, hey, whatever your net income is flowing out from this business, you might get a deduction of up to 20%, just straight off the top. That sounds huge, but you take 20%, multiply it by the tax rate of like 34%. It's a 6% reduction. Top individual rates are now like 35%. So it brings it down to more like a 29 or 30% tax rate versus a 21. So you still have an advantage in C corporations for the gathering of funds, but it's a little bit better. But there's a whole bunch of caveats on the ability to take this deduction. If you make too much money, you have to follow certain rules. If you're below that point, if you're married filing joint and your total taxable income of you as a family is below around 360,000, then you can take the deduction. Or if you have 300 and, you have to forgive me, this is all very new rules, like 320,000. If it's below 320,000, you just get to take this deduction. It's a bit of a calculation to figure out what it is. Works out to roughly 20%. But if it's over, if your home, not the business, is over 320,000, you might not get the deduction. There's certain professions that are not allowed to take the deduction, and they're pretty broad, and we have not been given much guidance yet on how to define that. One of the categories of people who are simply forbidden, CPAs, very depressing, lawyers. There's this whole group of people that have always traditionally been blocked from getting these things. Architects and engineers are usually in there. They got specifically accepted. They have much better lobbyists than us, apparently. Yeah. One of the categories of the 5 that are people that are not allowed to do it, it's the certain specific businesses, performing artists, athletes. One of the categories is if you are primarily get business because of the reputation of the owner, essentially. It's an incredibly broad category.
That's pretty big. Yeah,
no one knows what it means yet. We have guesses on what it means. We'll get more guidance. None of this affects 2017. Okay. On the individual side, on the new tax changes, overall, although it's way more complex than this, it was about a 3% reduction in taxes. So if you took all your taxes together and blended it up, paying about 20%, now you're going to be paying about 17%. But once again, it's way more complex than that. Yeah. They doubled the standard deduction. So if you were married filing joint at 12, now you get to take a $24,000 deduction. But at the same time, if you were married filing joint, you got 2 exemption amounts you got to deduct, which add up to $8,000. So historically, you had a $12,000 plus an $8,000 or a $20,000 deduction from your income before you figure out your taxes. Okay, they doubled the deduction. They took away the exemption. So they didn't double it. They increased it by about $1,950 per person.
So this is, and just to underscore that, this is something that I looked at last year, and basically what it boiled down to for me was, so I'm an LLC right now, and I decided that if I was going to go down the path of really taking on employees and doing that, then it made sense in order for me to get a C corp. It really didn't have anything to do with the tax changes that we're looking at right now. But that's what it boiled down to for me. So that's a gross generalization. But for me right now, where I am with my business, it made sense to keep it as an LLC. I want to move on to some of the other questions that we've got. So Trina asked a really good one. I'm going to answer first because I know you're going to disagree with me on this one. She asked, do I need a small business advisor or an accountant, or can I do this alone? So here's what I would say. When I started, I did this myself. Now, having said that, I have a background in finance, and so I know my way around Microsoft Excel. And I also believe in keeping things very, very lean. I only got insurance when a client said, you have to show us your certificate of insurance, which I know is not the right way to do it, but so be it. I only got, a checking account when I realized I was going to have to put the check somewhere. And then when I went to the bank and I said, hey, what does it take for me to get a checking account? They said, you need to have an EIN. I said, great, what's that? So in other words, I did all of this stuff on demand and probably pretty backwards to do it. So what I would say is that at a certain point, when you get started, I think that it's okay to do everything yourself. But then you get to a certain point where it's like, okay, I'm spending most of my time entering receipts, doing invoices, chasing people down for payment, paying out subcontractors, that sort of thing. And I think when you get to the point where it's no longer fun to do all that stuff, then it's the time to bring somebody else in. But what would you say?
Well, actually, I don't completely disagree with you, because the thing you left out in there, of course, was you were most likely moonlighting primarily or doing a very small amounts.
Right.
Everything is a cost benefit. If you're bringing in $15,000 a year, $10,000, $5,000 a year in some side business you're doing, paying someone like me $1,000 a year doesn't make any sense. Because to be blunt, the mistakes that you're going to make, the terrible, terrible, insane mistakes you're going to make, wouldn't cost you more than $100 an audit, because there isn't that big a deal you can do unless you're just making up numbers. Please don't make up numbers. Once you get to the point at which a mistake would cost you more than the fees to someone like me, is really the time you need to bring someone in.
Yeah.
So, but most of my clients who are business, they're able to take home out of the business at least $80,000 to $100,000 a year, and we're planning on how to get them to 200 and up. That's where it really starts to make sense, in my view. You can do it on your own, but there's also nothing wrong with going to someone like me or a business lawyer and going, I don't need you to prepare the taxes, I don't need you to do any of this stuff because I'm too small for any of that. I just want to make sure that what I did right, and I haven't done anything silly.
Sure.
Come to a CPA outside of tax season and say, I want to pay you for 2 hours of your time to look over what I'm doing and make sure I'm not shooting myself in the foot. Go to a business attorney or insurance person and say, hey, tell me why I need your product and see if it makes sense for you. Yeah. Now, obviously, I err on the side of having a professional advisor because, I got to eat. But it has to be the cost benefit.
Did you have a question, Lauren? What came in?
So a couple questions. Well, Trina was saying, and what happens if I hate all of that ? Smiley face.
And you hire somebody.
So, I think then you hire somebody.
There's a reason I hire a maid. I hate doing the work.
She's laughing. Okay, and then a question from Diana on a side note, and so hang on to this if it's for later, but she says, I've heard about DBA as opposed to LLC or sole proprietorship. Any thoughts on it?
Yeah, let's hang on to that one for just a second. I can actually hit that
in like 10 seconds.
Go for it. All right, go for it.
DBA has nothing to do with the other things.
Yeah.
A LLC or a business can choose to be doing business as something else. Right. You go to the courthouse, you file your fictitious name, you make sure it's available. It's just a way that you can have a name you want to present yourself as to people. That's all.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And DBA, of course, stands for doing business as. Back to at what point do we reach that threshold? Again, this is just my own perspective. I'll share with you what my journey was. I always did everything on QuickBooks, Quicken, because I like to do it myself. And then just as an experiment, one year I took my taxes to one of those places in the strip mall. I'm not going to tell you which one it was. And I did both, right? So I did it myself on Quicken. And then what they ended up doing for me saved me almost $10,000. So I was like, okay, that's great. I'm going to start bringing my taxes over here. And so it was sort of like a test balloon to see, how much they could actually save me. And I will say, just in the last couple of years, I've been noticing that the complexities have started to get to the place where now these folks can't really handle it, and that's why we're working together. So it's almost like you see where you're at in the development of your own business to say, at what point do I need to graduate to that next level? Another question that Trina brought up that I think is a really good one is the around insurance. Is that something that you'd like to field, or would you like to?
Yeah, I could field.
Okay, all right. So she wants to know how much she wants. She needs to get.
All right. Number one, in my view, nearly all business clients, people doing work for other people, should have business insurance in some way. There's two primary business insurances to have. There is the general liability insurance for the business. What's that? Someone comes to your office, slips and breaks their neck, and you get sued. Then there's a professional liability, which sometimes is called errors and omissions, which is, somehow they disagree with the way I did my job and are suing me. That's what protects you from that. The purpose of, in a perfect world, I would pay for my insurance for the next 25, 30 years, and I would never get a darn thing out of it because no one ever sues me. And I would, at the end, say, I'm so glad. The problem, in my view, the way you have to view insurance is not as how much does this cost me to get it? You have to take that into account because you have to be able to afford it. You can't be silly about it. You have to determine, are you going to do it? Is it worth doing? But more of a, what is the risk to me of absolute catastrophic destruction?
Mm-hmm.
What are my protections? Do I need the insurance to protect against that? Then you play, I like to send clients of mine to their insurance agents to play the scenario game, where they go and say, hey, I'm now moonlighting. I'm going out and doing these things. If I'm driving my car to a client and hit somebody, what happens? How am I protected? Do I need to change something? A lot of times you can do something as simple as a tweak when you are just moonlighting, doing a little bit here and there, and you don't see much risk of being sued by a client because you're not doing things that create situations like that. It might be as simple as needing what's called an umbrella policy to cover you.
Yeah.
But everyone should at least look at it, because it isn't a matter of the expense that I'm concerned about. It's making sure you actually look at it and go, what is my risk here?
Mm-hmm.
And should I pay something to protect myself from it, especially if you're being essentially a sole proprietorship?
I will say from my perspective, what drove me to get insurance was a specific question. I was working for a client. They said, send us your certificate of insurance. So I said, okay, give me a day or so. And so I had to go out and find an insurance company that was able to do that. So I'm insured up to $1 million. I'll just tell you what it is. I think that's pretty standard.
$1 million is 100,000 to $1 million is standard for smaller business. If you get a large contract with a large corporation, such as Lockheed or one of those guys for a real contract working with them, they usually require about a $5 million. It's not that expensive.
Yeah. I will say, so Lynn was asking if there were any horror stories when it came to insurance. I had a couple of things just because I didn't know any better. So on the one hand, okay, so I'm going to wax philosophic for just a second. So you mentioned errors and omissions are professional.
Yes.
Here's what I would say. As facilitators, it is not our job to actually come into the room with any advice whatsoever. In fact, we get into hot water when we switch hats and go from being facilitators to consultants. And so for that reason, I do not have errors and omissions because I'm not actually consulting on anything. I'm not telling anybody that they should do anything. So the reason that was a horror story is because I paid for that, and I don't think that I really need to. That was the first thing.
I can understand that. You have to look at the risk. If there's no real risk of you being sued, or for that matter, that suit winning, then you don't really need the insurance.
Nobody could come to me and say, well, Brian, you told us.
However, don't lie to yourself about that not being a risk.
The other thing that you said, I want to go back to it, is because this is another mistake that I made. So you said, you used the word umbrella coverage, okay? So I had a very expensive lesson early on where I had the general, which is the general liability. It's what you always get. And then I had the umbrella that was an additional $1 million on top of that, when I had one client who said, well, you have $1 million of coverage, we need to have you up to 2. So I got an umbrella that kind of bolted onto that. Okay. The job ended. And then I figured, well, I don't need this insurance anymore. Okay. So I went back to my insurance company and said, well, thank you very much. I don't think I need this anymore. And what they ended up doing is that they actually turned off my general liability. Okay. Which was kind of interesting. I find out later when I get my bill at the end of the year that all I had was that umbrella. And when I called them up, they said, well, all the umbrella is really good for is if you have that general liability. This just pluses you up. You're not actually insured for anything right now. You have no coverage. The umbrella by itself is worthless without the general underneath it. So how does that sit with you? Because I thought it was a little weird when I heard it.
That sounds a little strange. I'd have to talk to it. And once again, insurance, much like everything else, is very stage specific. You have to have a trusted insurance person that you're talking to. Luckily, a lot of the ones you have for your own personal have the ability to offer some of these. And if you talk to other business owners, you'll get a dozen references. And insurance is one of those things. It's like a commodity. You should be looking around and getting multiple quotes on it. This doesn't mean go every year to get a new insurance quote or every month or something like that, or put your insurance into a dozen different agents' hands. That actually tends to usually not work. But it does mean that you would expect your insurance agent to be able to walk you through. Like the big thing that on yours is the fact that you didn't know they canceled everything would have, I'm sure, left you furious at the agent.
I was a little ticked.
I would have been too. I would have been furious. I mean, I don't use that term very lightly.
We had a question about waivers. What are your thoughts on? And maybe I need a little bit more.
I'm not sure what you mean by
sorry.
waiver.
Can we go back?
Sure.
Just so hang on to that question. And then Trina had a couple questions related to the insurance, which may be good follow-ups. So she she said, I have 2 questions related to that. Number 1, I want to do graphic facilitation, graphic recording, and coaching. Can I get one insurance policy to cover 2 businesses? Yes, if I decide to go that way.
All depends on your insurance agent.
Yeah.
The insurance agency could write something to cover whatever they want, essentially, but you have to make sure that you know what's being covered. It's very clear. If you have 2 true different entities that you set up, then you might need to get a policy for each one. But that's really a much better question for an insurance agent, I'd say, than us.
I will say I do have 2 LLCs. I have my insurance through the same company, and I have 2 separate policies, one for each LLC. So.
And then Lynn, I believe, is following up on that and saying, and what if they were DBAs?
It's a good question.
The DBAs, I don't think makes a huge difference.
It'd be one
as
entity,
long
right?
it's still just one entity. You know, a DBA is kind of like, it's like if you have a company, inside of it you have 3 divisions. The divisions are not insured. The company is insured. A DBA is not necessarily a legal entity. So if I have Jones Consulting doing business as Jones Not Consulting and Jones Personal Consulting and Jones Business Consulting, my insurance would just be for the Jones Consulting on top. But once again, these are all questions that you would very specifically ask and get in writing a response
Most definitely.
from your insurance agent.
Thanks for that, Ed. Anything more on the waivers?
So a couple of questions around the waivers. Are you ready to go to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the waivers are, but I'm sure you'll be able to tell us.
So what are Edward's thoughts on waivers? And then in regards to waivers, is there any good way to have customers and clients sign waivers that mitigate some of the risk?
In lieu of insurance, probably.
What you're talking about is their contract you have with them where they agree to mediation or to not suing or something like
Terms
that.
and conditions. Yeah. Okay.
That is much more of a very specific contract question.
Yeah.
And we should not really answer that because we do not have the legal expertise to do so. But I'll certainly allow you
Yes, sir, I'll do it anyway. So I will say, I do use terms and conditions. I did hire an attorney to write mine very specifically.
That's the key. Yes.
There you go. Hired an attorney to write them very specifically based on the kind of work that I do. I try to keep my terms and conditions very light. There's all the standard stuff that's in there about, if we wind up in dispute, how do you want to handle it? There are some specific things that I have in there that are nuances of the job. Things like what happens if there's a cancellation. We spend a lot of time preparing for our events, and if somebody cancels 24 hours in advance, I kind of want to get a little bit of money for that because it's not like I can turn around and get a new client, in that time. So there's a few things in there like that. I'm happy to post out some of the highlights from my terms and conditions that I think are relevant to our job. I have a few things that are spelled out in my terms and conditions that are a function of the work that we do. So for example, that the client agrees that I will have space in order to be able to set up a wall that I can record on, that I'll have access to the space in advance so that there's an adequate amount of time for me to get the wall set up, hang paper, etc., that I can actually tear everything down. And all of this comes from those nightmare scenarios where you show up, the room's not available, and then bang, it's go time. They look to you and you're supposed to be ready to go and you've had no setup time. So it's almost like any time there was something that went wrong, it worked its way into my terms and conditions.
And that makes me realize that might have been more the real question you were asking, which I actually can't answer, as opposed to whether the clause in there can force into mediation or things like that. I'm just not qualified to answer that one. The purpose of your contract with your clients is to clearly state out to them what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and how you're able to do your job. The other purpose of it is to make sure you're able to do the job, and that if something happens on their side that's blocking it, you get paid what you expect to be paid, and you get remuneration. And if they don't pay you, what's supposed to happen? Are you going to charge interest? Are you going to charge a penalty? The point is to be as business-like as possible, because one of the least enjoyable parts of the job to do for anyone going into business for themselves is to collect money. It is. It's one of the least. And in order to collect money, to make it so that you're the squeaky wheel who gets paid, you want a contract in place that protects you, as you've described in your script, to make sure you can actually do your job so they can't just claim you weren't ready, we're not going to pay you. That clearly shows when they pay you, this amount up front, this amount when I'm done, and that then you can easily set up a system to get that money so that everything's court ready. Construction drives a lot of things because it's such a huge industry. In construction, one of the most dangerous things to do is to have an open-ended contract that doesn't deal with, hey, what happens when things go wrong? How do we do a change order? How do you have things sign off? I like all my clients to always have their work processed and their contracts court ready. So for instance, if you were going out to do that, the contract, before you go out there, they'd have signed off, you'd have received your deposit that you were supposed to get there, you'd have sent your reimbursement request in for travel, you will have gone in, you'll have collected your money. If anything goes wrong, they would sign off on the change order, and then at the end when you're done, you will have some way that they signed off indicating you did the work and they're happy.
Exactly.
Because that means they'll pay you because they'll lose in court.
Yeah, that one's really important, what Ed just said. And what I would say before I get to the question that's there. One of the things that I have in my proposals, right where it says, sign here, is you need to have this back to me by a certain date. I've had more than once clients will wait until the last minute, day before. They may not be answering emails. And so I actually have a bit of a deadline on it, and it's highlighted and says, if you do not get this back to me by such and such a date, it's usually about 2 weeks before an event. The proposal is null and void. So that's one thing, and it's come from clients waiting until the last minute. A couple of other things, and I just want to underscore what you already said, but the idea of non-payment, and for me, it's a percentage based on how many 30 days we go, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, right? I've only really had to pull that trigger once, but it's enough of a, hey, I'm serious about this, that it hasn't been a problem. The other thing that I would say that's a nuance to our industry is the idea of intellectual property rights. So a lot of the folks that are in our field come from a design and an illustration background, and sometimes what they put in their clauses have to do with reproduction rights on the graphic charts that come out of the back end of this thing. I don't come at it from an art and design background. I'm not saying that this is the right way. The way that I look at it, though, is that the client is hiring me for my time, and whatever they do with the product is entirely up to them. If they want to reproduce it 1 million times, great. It's got my name on it, some free advertising for me. Again, this is not something that the rest of the visual practitioners in the world agree with me on. It's just the way that I've decided to handle it, because I do not want to be the copyright cop chasing down every reproduction of a graphic chart that I did.
Yeah, you wait for that until you have a legal department.
Exactly. So we had a couple of questions come in.
Yes, just on contracts, would you suggest working with an attorney to draft a boilerplate contract?
Yes, in general, I recommend that you get a boilerplate. You attempt to adjust it to fit what you really want. Even if you take a step back and on a single piece of paper do a few bullet points of, I want to make sure I get paid, I want to make sure I win in court, I want them to pay more if they pay me late. Then kind of adjust the contract to that, then take it to a local attorney, because every state's different, and they will adjust it for you and sit down and walk through it. But you never want them to create it from scratch, because that's a lot of extra work for them that you're going to get billed for, $350 to $400 an hour.
Excellent. And this is just so we don't forget to, if you're comfortable, maybe throwing out your email and practice information at the end.
I'm a CPA, so I'm terrible at any sort of advertising, and I will be happy to do that.
Yeah, we'll definitely.
I know one person who's interested.
No,
who says pointing to.
That's for sure.
Excellent.
One of the questions that we had from before were just some general startup costs, and I compiled a list. Feel free to pile on this or not. So, and with help from both Lauren and Heather Lynn, they helped me pull this list together. So one of the things that I identified was what's called an agent fee. So again, this is just my own perspective, I use what's called a company corporation in order to file my LLC and get the legal entity started. You do that too, right?
Legal Zoom thing. Well, I don't do that.
You don't? Okay,
I do not.
I didn't want to take any business away from you.
No,
so
no, and I don't want to do that.
Glad we're talking.
Legal Zoom, people like that do that. Quite often, attorney firms do it. Usually, they charge between $100 to $500 a year. What they do is they're representing you. So, if somebody gets angry or sues or does things like that, they're the ones who gets the email on that to make sure you respond correctly. And then with most entities, there's the equivalent of state corporate commission of the state that every year you pay your fee to and send information to. It's very standard to use one of the Legal Zoom is the biggest one out there, but there's 100 of them out there to kind of put together the boilerplate. you need to bring in a specific attorney to do it. Attorneys tend to be a little bit more expensive. Usually when there's more than one person involved in setting up the company is when you really want to have an attorney involved, because you want to have things set up in such a way that if you get into a fight, you know what's going to happen. So
yeah,
yes.
and I would say for most of us, we usually start off as individuals. I use company corporation or incorporate.com. The fee for that, it was $500 to set it up. And then it's $425 for 3 years, for every 3 years going forward.
That sounds about right.
And that's the agent fee. That's what they take from me in order to file with the state and all of that stuff.
$100 to $150 a year. That's normal.
There's also a $50 incorporation fee, which is just the fee that it's like a pass through. That's when you're actually filing with the state to actually put the paperwork in. That's if you wanted to do it yourself. And I assume you can go down to the courthouse, but why would
you can actually go online and do it all.
Is that right?
Very easily. But it's also very easy to click a button and get it done. For that fee.
It's always easier. Right. Back to there's things that I like and don't like doing. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, just a question from Heather Lynn. How might I go about finding a good attorney?
You talk to me. The best way to find a good attorney, number one, the State Bar Association is always happy to give out referrals to accredited barred people. The really best way you can find an attorney is to ask people who work in business who they'd recommend.
That's exactly. Yep.
I send business clients to an attorney to create their little single member LLC or do their will if it's on an individual piece. The reason I send that, even though it costs a couple $100 more quite often, is it's the cheapest way to try out a business attorney and find out, do you like the way they talk to you? Do you like the way they respond to emails? Do you like how quick they are to do things and the advice they give? Mainly, you really want to go by word of mouth, and then you really, hopefully, have used the attorney before you really need them for something important. Because in most cases, when you get sued, which hopefully will be never, it's good to already have your business attorney than be desperately searching when you're in the middle of a lawsuit.
Yeah, I thank you so much for saying that, Ed. So the way that I did it was exactly that. I asked a bunch of people, and I picked somebody that I shopped around. I got to know them. I really knew that I wanted to have an attorney that I could work with, that we just met eye to eye and we had a good relationship with, which kind of was the way that worked for you and I. I think of it. The other thing is that, I used my attorney, among other things, the first thing right off the get-go was terms and conditions to help me out with my agreements. And then immediately following that was the agreements that I have with many of you as my independent contractors. That was the second thing that came right after that. And then it was just one thing after another as, the business grew. So he helped me out recently to get 3 trademarks, which I'm pretty excited about. But yeah, getting to know your attorney, being on a good, friendly basis with them. My attorney has open houses, and I'll make sure that I go there. It's a little wine and cheese, and you get to know them kind of on a personal level, so that you have the relationship, so that if anything ever does hit the fan, you have that good working relationship first. So building the relationship before you actually before you need it. He did help me. One thing I would say, he did help me in one case where I did need his help, was in one case of non-payment. So we talked about that a little bit.
The lawyer letter could be very helpful.
And boy, was I happy that I had a relationship with him before it got to that point.
And speaking about the relationship, that's the other piece. An attorney, much like your friendly CPA, tends to be one of the closest advisors a small business can have. If you don't like them, you don't get to know them a little bit, you're not going to ask them questions when you should.
Right.
Like one of the things that I actually do before, because I'm picky, before I accept someone as a client, I have to like them. I have to feel like, hey, I want this person to do well. And I have to feel they feel the same way, because otherwise you won't call them to ask questions when you should, which is an incredibly expensive mistake to make.
That's a really good point. I want to answer Trina's question, because it looks like we were kind of going back and forth about whether or not to use Incorporate or LegalZoom and all of that. So again, this is my perspective. It's what I did. Just getting started, getting the LLC, I used incorporate.com just to check the box and get myself a legal entity. And incidentally, the path that I took was, I'm going to see what's out there as a legal name that's available. I checked Lizard Brain, not available. Okay, fine. Lizard Brain Solutions, that's available. Got that one. So I started with that, and then just as my needs got to be more and more complex, as I really needed to work with somebody who understood the ins and outs of the business, that's where I ended up hiring a local attorney that could work with me on my terms and conditions.
And that's the standard way to do it.
Mhm.
Sometimes I send, if I have a client who I know is going to need an attorney for a reasonable amount very quickly, I will then send them for their LLC formation or corporate formation. If they're already walking in with half a dozen contracts, so I'm like, in this case, we might as well use the attorney to do it. It's going to cost $200 more to do it that way, and you'll know how they work.
Mhm.
But quite often, you just don't need anything else from an attorney for another year. Maybe you have one client. You don't really need to worry that much about your contracts being not perfect yet. Then it's exactly what you described. These are inexpensive services, and then you try out the attorney on your contract.
Which is
It's always the contract is the first thing, unless something goes terribly wrong.
Yeah, which is a good thing because attorneys can be a little expensive.
Yeah, they really
Okay,
can.
so let me run through a couple of the other expenses that we gathered. So we talked about the incorporation fee. Business license, so that's another thing.
Yeah, business license, I'm going to pick on Virginia, but
Yeah.
all the states have their own sets of rules, so on in place with that. In Virginia, when you set up your entity, you register that with the state corporate commission and pay its fee. That allows you to operate as an entity in Virginia. It doesn't allow you to commit business in any of the counties.
Right.
In order to do business in Fairfax County, you need to go get a business license. The good news is this is a dirt cheap thing in most cases. If it's under like $50,000, we're talking about $50, $20. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
Under $100,000, another amount. Above that, it's a gross receipts tax.
Right.
In addition, every year, to whatever county you're working in, you also need to file what's called a personal property tax return, in which you say, hey, these are the computers I have, these are the other assets that they tax you on. Unfortunately, they have to treat small businesses exactly the same as IBM is treated. So I often have clients come and say, really? I had to spend an hour on this form and they sent me a $3 bill?
Right.
And I'm like, and you'll have to do it again next year.
Right.
Because they have no way of knowing.
Yeah, and so thanks for bringing that up.
And
if I get this
multi-counties. You
right.
can end up, I have an HVAC client, heating and air conditioning, and they file in nearly every county in Virginia.
Mhm.
And they do every year. It's due within a couple months of starting your business.
Mhm.
And then it's due by March 1st of every year after that.
Right.
The personal property tax return in almost all counties is due on April 15th. Maryland has the equivalent of it, but it's one Maryland form. That's the Maryland personal property tax form. And that's actually where you pay your LLC fee or incorporation fee. All the states are different.
Yeah. And thanks for bringing up the gross receipts, because that was a bit of a surprise for me my second year in business. My first year in business, it was $60 in Fairfax County. Yay! And then because it's on gross receipts, the second year I got this, as I calculated, I'm like, it was a little heart stopping as it went from $60 to something that was
the number of
3 and 4
clients
digits.
I've had who've walked in because they were renting a temporary office space at one of the temporary spots you can rent an office here or there for. See, the county is fully aware that most people don't bother to get their license until forced to.
Mhm.
So they actually go and they find out everybody who rents from them, and then they go ask, hey, did you file a license? So the number of clients I've had walk in and go, hi, I need to file the last 5 years of my BPOL. The gross receipts can surprise you. When you start climbing up to a few $100,000 in revenue, that could be $300, $400, $600, and it's all dependent on the type of business you are.
Yeah.
It's not a huge amount, but if it's a surprise in multi-years, it's not any fun.
We had a couple of insights came in through chat, so I saw. So thank you, Heather Lynch. You mentioned that in Manassas City County, it was $25 for the business license, and then in Prince William County, it was $50.
And that's if you're below a certain revenue source. I assure you, if you go above a certain level, it's higher. They'll have a fixed fee between certain ranges. Usually above 100,000 in any of the counties, it's a percentage. It's like 0.1%. Yeah.
Earlier we talked about business insurance. I'll just share how much I pay. So it's $325 a year for that, $1 million general liability. I think that's pretty standard.
That's pretty standard. I see anywhere from 200 to 800, depending on what they're getting, what's covering. One thing to be thinking about, especially if you're collecting credit cards from clients or paying you that way or things like that.
Yeah.
Cyber security.
Definitely.
You should almost certainly be talking to your business attorney about, hey, I need to be protected from that also.
Right.
Because those are expensive and painful. Like I said, I cannot stress enough the importance of playing the scenario game with your insurance salesman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I do process a lot through credit cards, as a matter of fact. And I'll just tell you, so I use Square, and you see this at coffee shops all the time. And they have those little cards that you can just plug it into the bottom of your phone. So that's a thing if you need to process credit cards on the fly. Now, the one thing I would say about Square is that they make the sales tax thing. If you ever have to do that, a while ago I was selling visual templates. I think I've sold at a couple of Nova Scribes. And they make it really easy just to calculate sales tax to make sure that that works its way into your accounting system. And the other thing about Square is that they do have some pretty strong statements about the cybersecurity.
Yes.
So you can kind of ride off of their stuff without having to, and that makes it so you don't have to hold any credit card information or personal information or any of that stuff. Okay.
So
Yes, ma'am.
Thoughts on PayPal versus Venmo in relation to credit card?
I can answer that actually, because I
Awesome.
deal with that all the time.
Okay.
Venmo in general is still considered an infant, and it makes people very nervous. I've been hearing about all sorts of frauds going on with Venmo, but I don't have any proof on that. I do know that almost none of the business clients I deal with Venmo. So that always makes me a little nervous. PayPal, a lot of people use PayPal. The problem with PayPal is, number one, it's expensive if you have any volume going through. If you don't have much volume going through, it might be expensive from a percentage, but from an absolute, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
The main issue I've ran into with PayPal is it's actually a bank account. It can gather money inside of it. Money can be issued out of it to vendors. You can pay bills through PayPal. And a lot of times it's a big hole in the accounting system because they have monthly statements aren't sent from PayPal. You need to pull each one. So there can be a lot of complexity in there. And any money you receive in PayPal, you're going to get a 1099 from. There's all sorts of things you need to do with it. That happens with any of the in general, PayPal tends to be more expensive. The bigger you are, the more you want to move people towards more traditional.
Mm-hmm.
With traditional credit card processing, you're usually looking at paying about 2% out once everything's said and done. But credit card companies can be very confusing, the merchant service providers. They charge you in 3 different ways in most cases. They charge you a number of cents per transaction, a percentage for every transaction, and a monthly fee. Sometimes that percentage changes completely based upon what sort of cards you accept.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them, sometimes they hold your money for a few days and batch them all in together. Sometimes they pull their money out directly before they give it to you. Sometimes they give you all your money, which is, as an accountant, I much more prefer, and then they take their fee separate. In general, outside of my online stores, most businesses tend to avoid using PayPal because of the controls. If you have to use it and accept it, it can be an easy way to accept credit cards, essentially, but they tend to charge 4 or 5% when you shake it, versus the 3% or so that Square does, versus the 2% you can get to with more traditional Visa and MasterCard.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, I do use Square, and I think I need to double check this, but I think that the percentage that Square has is 3.25%.
Yeah.
And what I do, honestly, is I'll just stick it at the bottom of my invoice, and I'll say, I'm happy to take a check. If you prefer to process this by credit card, there's going to be a 3.25% charge on top of that. And for clients that want to pay that, it doesn't even ding me at all.
You have to be careful with your merchant service provider to make sure you're allowed to do that and don't have to call it like a cash discount. And there's been all sorts of court cases on that because it was trying to be blocked by various providers from doing that. And I don't know where that's settled, but probably easily Googleable.
Could you find out for me?
Sure.
Thanks. All right. Do we have a couple of questions come in?
Let's see, Diana said level up is another option, and Trina was foot stomping your question.
Cool, thank you for that.
Oh, and I will say, everybody in Europe thinks we're insane with all the checks we write and the credit cards and everything else that we do, and they just don't understand why we don't do ACH everything. Mainly because our banking system isn't fully set up for it.
It's expensive.
But sometimes that's a better answer than others, depending, like if you're primarily paid $7,000 to $8,000 to $10,000 for an engagement.
Yeah.
Then you know what? An ACH dollar fee might be way less than any percentage thing you're paying.
And
there's some strange stuff.
To that point, I usually just say, okay, to my clients, I say, here's all the different ways that you can pay. You can cut me a check, we can do ACH, we can do a credit card, whatever works best for you. I'll take it in dollars if you want. You can, pay me cash.
Cattle.
If you like, And we've done barter from time to time, which is probably something else that we should talk about. Yeah, that's later. But I try to make it as easy for my clients as possible. Yes, ma'am.
Go back on insurance. Just if you have, Heather Lynn was asking, sorry, I missed that one, Heather Lynn. She said hers was quoted around 500, and she was curious about approximately what actually she was specifically asking you, Brian, what yours was quoted at.
So specific. You don't want to touch that.
I really don't. That's very, very specific, and I think and the thing is what will happen is that every insurance company is different, and what will happen is that they will look at you as an individual, and they will kind of take you for the sum of your parts, and the quotes can be different based on kind of how they size you up. Okay, so for specifics on that, Heather Lynn, I'll connect with you offline later on.
Yeah, and I can tell you in general, you tend to go and get 3 insurance quotes. You choose a local carrier, you choose a bigger carrier, and then you choose someone you're already doing business with on your personal side. And you get 3 quotes, and you make sure they're apples to apples. You look and go, this is what this is, this is what this is, this is what this is. And from that, you can usually make a good decision.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple of other just costs as we went through it. So this is the path that I took. I've said that this is the one that I needed to, because like I said, I had to kind of back into it. I've been told that you don't necessarily have to go at it this way. When I first looked at getting a business checking account, I wanted to keep it separate from me as an individual. And what I was told by my bank is that, well, in order to do that, I really had to have an EIN, which is a unique identification number for my business entity, so that it's like a social security number for your business. So that's what the bank told me. So I did. So I went and I applied for an EIN. I did that with the IRS. It took a couple of weeks, came right in.
You can now get it within a day. It's an online tool awesome. You can put in. There's a while where they were having some fraudster issues, and they kind of tightened it up a bit. But I think they've solved that. You can get it very fast.
Awesome. So for me, that was a path. I got my LLC through the company corporation, then I got my EIN, and then I got my business checking account. Now, I've heard that you don't necessarily need an EIN in order to get a business checking account.
You don't have to, because of the Patriot Act and a few other things having to do with banking. More and more they require it because they need to have some way to describe it. For instance, it's possible as a sole proprietorship to simply have a separate bank account in your own name. So it isn't the business name's on it, it's your name, because you and the business are the same thing.
Right.
In general, though, I always encourage a completely segregated account, both for business, both on the credit card side and on the personal side. And for multiple business reasons besides just tax reasons. You want to make it easy on yourself to figure out your revenue and your expenses, to isolate things, to be able to make it so it's easier for you to track how you're doing and to make sure you're catching all your expenses.
Most of the way that I get paid, I would say 90% of the time, it's by check.
Yeah.
Somebody writes me a check. One of the things that I wish that I had done is I checked with the bank that I'm currently with. I'm pretty happy with them, except for a couple of things. They have a cap on the size of the check that you can actually deposit using the mobile deposit.
Yes.
And for me, it just happens to be $5,000. And yeah, it's pretty low, isn't it?
You might want to check, see if they have a different account type you can get with a higher one.
I will
or
talk
if
to
they'll
them
get you a
about that.
special check scanner for business.
Right. And I know, I mean, it's like, whoa, $5,000. But if you're doing a multi-day event, right, and if you're doing like 2, 3, 40, I mean, that can total up pretty quick.
You could easily be paying 70% of that out to other people going, and you're just being the front man.
All right.
That's easy.
The other thing that I wish I'd known, and they didn't advertise this, is that they had, so Diane, I'll get back to you on that one a little bit later offline. I don't want to recommend anybody in particular. But the other thing that I wish I checked is not only did they have a cap in terms of the size of the individual check that you could deposit using mobile, but they also had a cap in terms of the daily amount that you could deposit. So, you know, if I would get 3 checks that came in, I'd have to deposit one day, and then wait, deposit another one the other day, and then wait, deposit another one if I didn't want to run to my local branch.
And that's usually the type of account you have, although the scanning piece can be interesting. Banks are in business to make money. They primarily make money by lending money out to other people, but many of them, their accounts are also revenue sources, not just sources of funds for them to lend out. It's important to understand what sort of bank account you have and what other ones they have available. They usually run a huge gamut, ones that only allow you to deposit a certain amount, ones that require you to keep a certain amount of money in the account, ones that you're only allowed to have a certain number of transactions. The problem with a mistake in the sort of account you set up is you can quickly add up to a rather expensive lesson, because you maybe don't realize it until you get your bank statements and see all the extra fees they're throwing on there. Having a good banker that you can talk to and will help you is critical.
And I think that's the overarching theme to this whole conversation. You know, as a small business owner, it helps to have somebody that you can just go in and talk to. The thing that I really like about my bank and why I'm not going to switch, even though the mobile thing is kind of a challenge, is that my local banker, he knows me. I can go in, I can have conversations. He helps me out as a notary public when I need that. And the other thing is it doesn't cost me anything. There's no additional fees throughout the year. It's a free business checking account, which is important to me. I want to keep my expenses as low as possible. The only thing that I pay for out of that, and this is another expense, is $85 every time I need a new checkbook to write checks.
And the reason you do that is you're probably going through the bank to do it. Any printer, including online or any local printer, can do your checks.
Oh, cool.
Any of them, as long as you get them what one of the checks looks like.
Really? Can I put like little lizards on it or whatever I want to?
Almost certainly.
Word. I'm doing that next time. Thank you for that. Okay. A couple of other things that and I saw it from Heather Lynn. Costco sells business checks for $35. So thanks for that, Heather Lynn. Couple of the other expenses as we're moving into marketing now. Just $20 for business cards. Yeah, no worries. We had a couple of questions about website hosting. And I want to get back to it, so I'm hitting it dead on. So the question was, can you provide key first steps to start up a website with online showcasing of materials, services, and testimonials? Do you mind if I fill that one? Is that okay?
Being I'm pretty sure I don't even have a website, yeah.
All right, cool. So I'll just, again, this from my perspective, I'll just say what I use. I like Squarespace. I got into Squarespace because I just happened to be listening to NPR at the right time when they were doing an ad, and I was like, that's kind of interesting. And then when I saw that most of the clients that Squarespace used, even though they had some online retail, it seemed like most of it that they were pretty geared towards people that had something visual in their business. Either they were artists or photographers or designers. And so for that, I chose to go with Squarespace. I've been very, very happy with that since then. It integrates very well into online sales if you ever want to go down that way. And the thing that I really like about Squarespace, and I'm sure a lot of other websites do this, is that it has good blog features that sync up well with things like MailChimp. And so for my blog that I've got, one of them is called Chief Visualization Officer, I get an idea, I get a good idea from Ed, I can type it into my phone, and bam, it shows up on my blog on my website, and it goes out to everybody that's on my MailChimp list. So that's that. Wix is the other one, so thank you very much for bringing that one up. I don't use Wix, it's just because I started with Squarespace, and that's what I'm used to. It seems to me like those are the top two. And maybe I'll just open it up there. Lauren, you use Wix. Anything you want to say about that?
I like it. I think you can plug different widgets into it, which I haven't done a lot with. There's an application that I've been using if you're going to take on like coaching clients called Setmore, which I like, SCTMORE, and I liked that. I tried a couple of these appointment scheduling things, like Square will also schedule your appointments, but I felt like the Setmore platform was more user-friendly for the end user. And you can also charge, if you're taking on coaching clients, you can charge through Setmore too.
Okay.
So
Thanks
they
for
just
that.
sign up there.
The one thing that what you're kind of touching on is the idea of having some interoperability between the different widgets and the different sites. And one of the things that Heather Lynn helped set up for me was that connectivity between my blog and then MailChimp, so that things would be practically automatic in the way that they go out. And so for us as visual practitioners, so much of us is staying present in the minds of our clients. Social media is a big thing. So thinking about how things sync up with Facebook, Instagram, the other visual media that are out there, so that you can get your stuff out there.
And I always view it from the accounting perspective. CRMs or client relationship management softwares combined with your ability to blog and all the other pieces combined into your accounting. So I mean, the beautiful idea would be somehow my scheduling software will also transmit the information I need to them, will bill them, will collect the money, and will tell it directly into my accounting software. The problem with that is, in most cases in a small practice, you don't want to spend $20,000 on your accounting and CRM software. Right. And that's about what it costs to get one that actually interacts all together. So you've got a dozen different systems that try to work together. Like in most cases, most of the clients I deal with work with QuickBooks for their for their accounting.
I had a question about that.
Yeah, and they all use QuickBooks because QuickBooks and Peachtree about 15 years ago had a huge fight, and everyone knows who QuickBooks is, so that tells you who won it.
Yeah.
And in the end, now they've moved to primarily an online. They're really trying to push everybody to that, where they get about $50 a month. But for $600 a year, they provide a certain service. It's not going to compare to a $10,000 to $20,000, but it's going to be a lot easier to use. They then sell a whole bunch of widgets that attach to QuickBooks, or things feed into it, and some of them do a really good job. Some of them do a terrible job. I've dealt with ones in which the invoicing system sends out the invoices perfectly. Your CRM takes care of all that and feeds into QuickBooks, but it only feeds into QuickBooks the ones that are paid by credit card. The ones that pay by check just don't appear. There's all sorts of weird ones, and there are new ones that seem to appear every year. The main thing I advise all my clients to do now when they're in startup is the number one thing: whatever they're using, they want it to have been around at least 5 years. Don't ever be the beta test.
Yeah.
It won't go well.
Yeah. I really appreciate that.
And in general, the accounting software needs to be completely separate from everything else, because everything else does a terrible job on the accounting software.
Yeah, and actually the reason that I'm a little bit slow, like I'm not using Wix, I'm not using, what was the other one that was like not PayPal? Venmo.
Yeah.
Thank you. Couldn't remember.
Venmo just makes me nervous, but no real reason to. I just don't know it well.
Yeah, I tend to be in like kind of the late majority when it comes to that sort of thing, because I really want it to work, and I want to forget about it. You know, I don't want it to be something that I'm going to have to constantly nurse. Okay, so I have a couple of questions for you, and just to do a time check, we have about 9 minutes left.
Oh God, I got hours more I can go over. Oh well.
Let's not do that. So there's a few things that I want to talk to you about in terms of the kinds of things that I can kind of make business expenses. Okay. So one of those is training. This is kind of a new industry. You know, we get out there quite a lot, and there's always a new workshop that you can go to. You can go and learn from something. How much of those expenses can I put back on the business?
Business expenses. Yeah. Code section 162, ordinary and necessary business expenses. This means in most cases, training should be deductible. Education should be deductible. Things that teach you what it is that you are then using to sell your services should be deductible. But in the case of people who are moonlighting and doing things like that, doing part-time work, you run into a weird situation in which, well, was this training for your day job? Was this training for the business that you're doing? Was this training for something else? Real estate investors have a huge issue with people come out and saying, hey, I have this $25,000 training thing you can take. We walk you through your first couple of deals. We do all this stuff, and it's 100% tax deductible. No, it's not. IRS is pretty clear about that. They lose in court all the time. It is, if it's underneath a specific piece, it can be capitalized. There can be all sorts of weird things going on. In general, the way I like to advise clients, if it's an ordinary and normal business expense that you can see everybody else doing and it makes sense to do it, it's probably deductible. If it's something that you can imagine someone abusing like mad, they probably have. They've been caught. They've been dragged into court, and we have court cases and guidance on it from the IRS. The classic things that people have issues with, something called listed property. Listed property is a technical term with the IRS. It means both business and personal use. So how do you deduct your cell phone?
Yeah.
How do you deduct your car? How do you deduct the use of the internet at home? How do you deduct things that look like vacations? How do you deduct entertainment? How do you deduct travel? There are specific rules on all of these that are pretty easy to follow. The IRS has publications you can read through. In general, you just want to be aware that when you're touching into something that might have an issue where you can imagine someone abusing the heck out of it, that's when we need to do a little research or ask. Most of it boils back to documentation. How do you deduct your vehicles? You deduct your vehicles in two ways. Mileage, assuming you're a sole proprietorship, totally different rules otherwise. Mileage or actual. How do you know which one to take? You're supposed to figure out both each year and take whichever's bigger, but when you do actual, you stay with it. Well, how do you do that? All of it starts with a mileage log. Your business versus your personal. There's a whole bunch of great apps out there for helping to track that mileage log, by the way.
Pick me. QuickBooks does it.
Yeah, QuickBooks does it. Miles IQ does it. There's all sorts of really good ones. Once you figure out your total mileage, you can multiply that by the mileage rate to see how much a deduction you'd get in that case. Other times, or you take that percentage against all the actual expenses, and all sorts of complexity in there. Same thing with your phone in theory.
Yeah.
Same thing with home office use. All sorts of these things. It's an hour lecture just to go into these. So just be aware there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there, especially with the new tax act. A lot of bad information.
So the bottom line is that look for, any opportunity for, well, figure out what it means to you for home office, for training, for car and mileage.
And the IRS has reasonably good publications on it. Their publications are always slanted towards the IRS view as opposed to what might actually be the court view.
Got it.
But most cases, that's not going to make a difference for most people.
Okay. Couple other things I just want to, let's see. Okay, so it looks like we had
I was just wondering if
question,
Trina could clarify her question. Okay, going back to deductions, thank you. Like training, it applies for both work and moonlighting.
If you have training that you think applies to both, then in my view, you have to come up with a reasonable reason, a way to allocate it and simply follow that. It has to be something reasonable.
Yeah.
So for instance, training that your work is happy to reimburse you for and does reimburse you. Well, you can't double dip. You can't take the reimbursement and deduct it. Training that your work strongly encourages you to do and wants you to do, and you're going to get some advancement for doing it. Okay, that's probably a work training. Your work could care less about any training you do when you're doing it and then directly trying to apply it to the work you're doing. That's probably going to be a business deduction. Of course, then you run into issues of, well, you spent $10,000 on training here, but you made $1,000 in your business that you're working, and you're not going to make any more for the next 3 or 4 years. That doesn't sound ordinary or necessary. That doesn't sound like it's a business. Then you can run into business versus hobby rules. It gets complex, but a lot of it's common sense. If you look at it and go, I'm doing this training so I can sell these services, and I'm going out and trying to sell these services. You have a reasonable argument. With, my training was on a cruise ship in the Mediterranean. There are specific rules related to that, by the way. Mainly it's not deductible, but sometimes it is. So there's a lot of different pieces.
Board meeting on a cruise ship. I think that's a really good idea.
International or non-waters? It changes it.
I guess it depends. All right, we'll definitely talk about that. So I made a quick list of just some of the ongoing business expenses that I have, just to give people an idea of the kinds of things that they might want to think about. What may be coming for them. So I pay for Microsoft 365, and through that I get Outlook, Word, everything that I need for the Office suite. So there's that.
Technically, you should be tracking to see if personal versus business.
Practically,
it's almost always purely business. I've never had an agent fight me on that in an audit.
Yep. Another one is the Adobe Creative Cloud. I know there's a lot of other free programs that are out there to do pretty much the same thing that Photoshop and Illustrator do. But for our line of work, I just think it works.
You are not required. You are allowed to have made a poor business decision. So when the IRS agent comes in and says, could have gotten this free thing. Why should I let you deduct this?
Yeah.
You can go, you know what? You're not allowed to decide if my business decision was good or not to determine whether or not I can take the deduction. This is ordinary and necessary.
Yeah. A couple of other quick hits of just some services that I pay for. So Zoom, which is what we're using right now, I think it's a great thing for virtual facilitation. You can do breakout rooms, so that almost the same things that you can do in the room, you can do virtually. Something that I just started, 2 things that I just started. One of them is called Session Lab, which I think is fantastic. If you're familiar with Google Docs and the way that you can collaborate with somebody that way. What Session Lab is, it's a way of creating facilitation guides and instructional agendas. It has the same collaborative function that Google Docs does, where somebody else can jump in and they can make some changes. But more than that, and I think it's more valuable, is that it actually ties into the International Association of Facilitators methods database. So you can actually drag and drop different methods from that very rich source of facilitation methods. And so that's a great thing. And then I want to get your thoughts on this one, because I just started doing it. I signed up for the United mileage just because I got really sick of doing baggage fees and all that sort of thing. So is there any advantage other than...
United mileage is an interesting creature.
Yeah.
In theory, you can use that anytime you're doing any flying. I would actually simply keep track of personal versus business flights, and I at least take that percentage. Like I said, in theory, they might be able to come in and say, no, you shouldn't be able to take that at all. That's also not a huge amount.
Percentage.
So at the very least, you could show this has been a reasonable method I've taken with it.
Okay, great. So we just have like about a minute left. Any other questions that popped up that maybe we missed?
We have hours more we could go.
We'll do another one of these. What do you think?
Trina asked how much Adobe costs, and Heather Lynn looked that up. Thank you, Heather Lynn. $650 annually or $49 a month. Excellent. Any other burning questions? Go ahead and put them in the chat, or if you.
Yeah, I got that one. So the International, excuse me, the International Association of Facilitators is a fantastic resource for facilitators. They have a methods database that's online, and if you Google it just like that, IAF methods database, it'll pop up. They recently went into a partnership with Session Lab, which is that that collaborative planning platform, where Session Lab prettied up the methods database. The old IAF methods database was kind of like a web 1.0 version. So this new version looks really good and easy to use, and I highly recommend it. A couple of the other the associations that I'm a part of. So thinking about what some of your startup costs might be, I mentioned IAF, that's a great one. Clearly, the International Forum of Visual Practitioners, yay. MAFN, the Mid-Atlantic Facilitators Network, and then finally CBODN. I think we lost Lynn earlier, but I think she's actually in charge of that one. Yep. So the Chesapeake Bay Organizational Development Network. This actually all ties back to one question. I think I'd be remiss if I let it go, which is how do I do some targeted marketing? And that one came from Trina. So I rattled off that list as a way of suggesting a way to do some targeted marketing. Here's what I'd say. The most important thing is to get your name out there, is to get out there in front of people who will potentially use your services. For us as visual practitioners, we're graphic recorders, we're graphic facilitators. The kinds of people who will hire us will be organizational development consultants, traditional facilitators, coaches, and business leaders. So going out to some of those groups that I just mentioned, volunteering at the Chamber of Commerce, they have tons of meetings out there. And if you say, hey, I'm a graphic recorder, this is what I do, I say, without ego, I did one job for, at the time, the Fairfax County Chamber of Commerce, and it gave me a client that over the course of my my time with them, it brought in almost $250,000 of work. And so being very targeted about the kinds of pro bono work that you do just to get your name out there. This is tough to describe as a job, and if you haven't seen it, it's tough to get. So the best thing that you can do is to get your name out there and have people experience what it's like to work with a visual practitioner. Anything you want to add to that?
I think you pretty much hit most of the pieces. The only other thing to think about is, you said volunteer opportunities are in front of groups. Passive advertisement works in a way. I mean, your website, all the things you have up there, your blog, so on, everything I've seen with all my clients across a whole bunch of fields is the web, the ability to search for people on the web using Google and other search engines is the new yellow pages.
Search engine
so you have to be able to be found.
Definitely.
And that's where you have to spend your money when you're looking for passive. But I suspect yours would be far more effective since it's such a specific.
Trina had a question. She says, do you think my name will work for or against me? Now, I got a question for you. Do you mean Trina or that other name that you told me about? Waiting for the response. I'm going to assume you mean your actual name, Trina. I don't see why that's so hard for people. My last name is Tarallo. I think you say it once and either people get it or they're not really paying attention. I like Trina. It sticks out. The one thing I would say is with a weird last name like Tarallo, you're really easy to find. If nobody remembers you other than your name, right? If they Google, okay, this guy's name was Tarallo and he's a graphic facilitator, I'm pretty easy to find that way. Trina, I'm hoping the same applies to you. So
try and find Edward Jones.
Yeah. You're all over the place. You're everywhere. By the way, do you want to say something about it? This is not the same Edward Jones?
Oh, I am in no way associated with the investment company. I'm an independent CPA with my own practice.
Thank you.
Trina was just chiming in.
I was going to say, yeah, it's been tough for me because, I mean, on the one hand, I have such a unique name. I mean, there are no other THRINEs around.
Right.
On the other hand, like if I wanted to do, which I have, trinakane.com, I don't want to have to be, and this is just an issue where I don't know if I want to be explaining to people constantly how to say my name. Or go to my website, trinakane.com, spelled THRINE. It's Norwegian.
That's actually pretty fast.
Yeah. That's not bad. I mean, think about all the people that, I mean, bought, Bug Faucet, right? Nevada Lane. I mean, we've got all kinds of people.
I'll give you mine as an example because I thought I was being clever. My name is Edward Jones or Edward Bernard Jones.
Mm-hmm.
So my email is ejones@ebjcpa.com. I thought, easy. No one will ever have a problem with that. I never thought about the fact the E and the B, the J and the A, the C and the P kind of rhyme together.
Mm-hmm.
I have yet to be able to tell anyone my email without carefully going, my name is Edward Bernard Jones, EBJ, and I'm a CPA, so CPA.com.
Yeah. So phonetic alphabet, Echo, Bravo, Juliet, Charlie, Papa, Alpha.
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
So a unique name like yours that you can literally describe in one sentence, the Norwegian spelling spelled this way will lock in their heads. I kind of like it. It's easier than mine.
Okay.
Because I'm an accountant, I'm always wrong.
All right. Well, Ed, thank you so much for your time. I don't think there's anything else out there. So next steps, what we're going to do is, with your permission, what we'll do is I'll clean this up a little bit in Adobe Premiere, and then we will drop it out there, get it on YouTube, and we'll include a link on Nova Scribes, and we'll also include your email address so if people have got follow-up questions for you, they know where to find you. I also have a couple of tasks. I'm going to put together just a quick matrix that talks a little bit about Nexus and what we need to know about that.
Send me a reminder on that.
I'd like to get your advice on that. I'll also pull in some highlights from my own terms and conditions. And again, I'll just put it out there, use it at your own risk. But it's worked pretty well for me. Okay. Ed, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And thank you, Nova Scribes, for joining us tonight. Good night.